Hey everyone, how's it going? I am here to belatedly chat about parts 2 and 3 of Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman. So I talked briefly last time about what this novel is about, but just to refresh your memories, it's a sprawling story with a huge cast of characters, all of whom are involved in the Eastern Front during World War II. A lot of them are Russian. There's also a small group of German characters who are followed for a time. There's one character who's Tatar. There's a character who appears who's Georgian. And there are some characters of other nationalities. And some characters are Jewish as well, and others are not. But it's a sprawling story about a huge cast of characters involved in the Second World War. And if there's a central character in this story, it's a guy named Victor Strum. He is, as Robert Chandler says in the introduction to my New York Review of Books Classics edition, Victor Strum is in many ways a self-portrait for Vasily Grossman, the author. Victor Strum is a chemical engineer working on his research at a university, and Vasily Grossman was also a chemical engineer. And he himself is actually not, he's one of the few characters who's not directly involved in the war, by which I mean he's not on the front or anything. And his struggle is primarily with the repression of the Soviet state and his kind of contrarian views that become highly problematic for the Soviet state. There's a really striking passage where Victor Strum says something to the effect that, scientific laws don't care whether or not they align with Soviet ideology. They just are what they are. And that causes a big problem for him, as you imagine. And so that's sort of the crux of his story. But then also his wife's son from her first marriage is killed on the front. They also have a nephew who fights on the front, and other more distantly related relatives are on the front. They have one relative who gets captured by the Nazis and gets sent to a death camp because she's Jewish. And that passage where this woman, along with a young boy who she meets and kind of takes under her wing, are put into a gas chamber is harrowing. One of the most powerful things I have ever read, something I probably won't ever forget. Robert Chandler does say in his introduction again that this novel, as well as some of Vasily Grossman's other writing, are some of the most powerful fictional portrayals of the Holocaust. And I haven't read very much Holocaust literature, but I would find it extremely difficult to disagree based on my experience reading it. But anyway, it's a tough book for me to talk about in a lot of detail just because there are so many characters. But I want to read to you a passage in the book that I really love and that I think is sort of the thematic crux of the whole thing. And so this is the passage. It actually comes from a chunk of the novel that's like an essay that one of the characters wrote, which is a kind of device that Vasily Grossman uses twice in this book. Once with a letter from a mother to her son, and this time in this sort of essay that this character wrote. But at the end of this essay, the character writes this: "Human history is not the battle of good struggling to overcome evil. It is a battle fought by a great evil struggling to crush a small kernel of human kindness. But if what is human in human beings has not been destroyed even now, then evil will never conquer." And that seems to me like the crux of the whole novel, and I think that passage is so profound and speaks so truly to history, right? Because we live in such a crappy world where crappy things happen, and it seems like the people with all the power are the worst people in the world. And it's hard often to have actual hope, right? And that passage is not super hopeful, right? Because it says that basically most of what happens in this world is evil, and there's only the small kernel of human kindness. But it does seem hopeful in the sense that it's just hopeful in the sense that I think it speaks so truly to my experience and a lot of other people's experiences of this world, and for some reason that is in its way sort of hopeful. But that's a passage again that I think will just stick with me as I move forward in my life. And so now I just want to talk about some other themes that I found interesting that I saw in this novel, and then I will leave you. But the first theme, or not necessarily theme, but structural comment I have about this novel is that it sometimes doesn't read like a novel. Actually, it sometimes reads more like a kind of collection of short stories, because there are some characters who only appear for a few chapters, and we follow them a little bit, and then we leave them, and then we never hear from them again. One particularly striking example of that is a Russian soldier who has been captured by the Nazis. And the Russian soldier is not related to the Shaposhnikovs. We never hear from him again after this story or anything. But he has been captured by the Nazis. He's basically been driven to emaciation. He's emaciated. He's on death's doorstep. And finally, these Nazis who have him just say, okay, we can't bring this guy any further because he's clearly dying. Let's just leave him. Let's just abandon him. And they think that he's just going to go and die. But he manages to actually drag himself to a little town, a little Ukrainian town, incidentally, and this Ukrainian family takes him in and nurses him back to health. And what's really striking about that passage is the exchange that this Russian soldier has with the mother in the Ukrainian family, because she says something critical of the Stalinist regime, and then he kind of defends the Stalinist regime, and then she makes a reference to the horrible famine in the Ukraine that happened in the early 1930s, which was orchestrated by Stalin. Stalin deliberately orchestrated a famine in the Ukraine in the early 1930s. There's actually a video that was just posted about it. And when the Russian soldier defends the Soviet Union, she says, you know what? In the 1930s, you know how you looked when you were on our doorstep, emaciated? That is how all of Ukraine looked in the early 1930s. And what comes out in that passage, actually, is that she didn't know that he was Russian when she took him in. And you get the sense that she might have acted differently if she had known that he was Russian when he first appeared at their doorstep. But she doesn't kick him out or anything. She doesn't seem to hold on to much resentment, although that's where the story ends and we never follow them again. But, it was just such a powerful little story, this act of kindness that she showed him, and then she felt conflicted about her act of kindness, but also the historical resonance of her mention of the famine in the Ukraine, and of course that just spoke even more strongly with what's going on right now with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But that's just an example of one of these sort of little stories within the novel. And Robert Chandler, again, to reference his introduction, actually says that even though Life and Fate is often compared to War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, and is modeled roughly on the structure of War and Peace, Tolstoy is actually not the primary influence on Grossman, according to Robert Chandler. Actually, Chekhov is a much closer influence, and he says that stories like the one I've just described to you actually those stories read more like Chekhov stories than they do like something from Tolstoy. And that just makes me more curious to read Chekhov, because I've only read one play by Chekhov, so I can't say that I know him well, so I can't speak to how true what Robert Chandler says is. But definitely this novel does read in many ways like a collection of short stories. Another really, I think, powerful aspect of the book that comes out is how it shows people from both sides of the war. So most of the characters are Russian, are on the Soviet side of the war, but there are some German characters who appear as well. And so you do see both sides. And what Grossman seems to emphasize is that even though certain individuals are caught on the opposite sides of the war, they are united in their humanity, I guess. I mean, that might sound like a cliche, but for example, one of my favorite passages in the book is when a Russian soldier is fleeing, basically, from, or no, he's not fleeing, but he's on his way somewhere, and then suddenly the Germans start to attack. They start to bombard the Russian position with artillery. And this Russian soldier has to take shelter in a crater that he just happens to find. And it also just so happens that a German soldier was in the area and also had to take cover from the German artillery fire. And the German soldier jumps in the crater as well. But neither of them has the presence of mind in that moment to realize that they're on opposite sides, that the German soldier doesn't realize that the Russian soldier isn't German, and the Russian soldier doesn't realize that the German soldier isn't Russian. So they actually hold hands during the span of this artillery fire while they're, holding on for dear life, hoping they don't get hit. And then when the artillery fire ends and they both kind of emerge, they see that the German soldier sees that the other guy's a Russian, and the Russian sees that the other guy's German. And they realize that they've just been, sort of huddling together, these two soldiers from opposite sides of the war. And they decide to not, fight or anything. They don't kill each other, they don't attack each other, they just part ways, right? And so this brief moment of, human unity in this terrible situation, right? That scene reminded me a lot of a really great scene from Homer's Iliad, where a Trojan soldier named Glaucus and a Greek soldier named Diomedes realize in the midst of battle, when they're fighting each other, that they have some shared ancestry. And so they stop fighting each other, and they actually exchange armor, which is kind of a sign of honor in that ancient Greek culture. And they also part ways. They decide not to fight anymore with one another. They fight other Greeks and Trojans, but they don't fight each other. And that sort of unity of individuals on opposite sides of this war really comes out in this novel in really powerful ways, as I hope I sort of conveyed in my description of this story. But another way in which we see the kind of unity of the two separate sides is in a more kind of sinister way, because we get a very vivid portrait of what it was like to live in the Soviet Union, this very repressive regime, where if you spoke out of turn, it could cost you your life or your livelihood, or you could be sent to Siberia, and so on and so forth. This intensely repressive regime. You get a really vivid portrait of what it was like to live there. And what's interesting is that Grossman invites comparisons between Nazism and Stalinism, basically. He basically equates the two. He says that even though they each thinks that it's so much different from the other, they really are quite similar in many ways. Not only the repressive totalitarianism, but the nationalism as well, the genocidal nationalism, right? Stalin had some very anti-Semitic policies, and he had people sent to labor camps in Siberia, he had prisoners slaughtered, he deported people from specific countries to other places. For example, I learned in a novel called A Constellation of Vital Phenomena by Anthony Mara that he had a lot of Chechens from the region of Chechnya deported to Central Asia for a long time, and they weren't able to return until later in the 20th century. But he also did that to people in Ukraine, to Russians in Ukraine, and to other people. So there are these ways in which Stalinism was very, very similar to National Socialism. And Grossman invites this comparison, which is kind of the part of the novel that was the most offensive to the Soviet authorities. I mentioned in my previous video that when Grossman tried to get this novel published in 1960, the novel itself was arrested by the KGB, actually. They thought it was so dangerous in its portrayal of the Soviet Union that they arrested the novel and seized all copies, or what they thought were all copies of it. And the equating of communism with Nazism was one of the primary reasons that they saw it as dangerous, among other things. So that was really a fascinating part of the book as well. And again, to reference Robert Chandler's introduction, it is just a stunningly real and sort of frightening portrayal of what it is to live in a repressive society. in particular in the Soviet Union. So, and then one last thing I want to touch on before I let you go. I want to return to Victor Strum briefly, because I mentioned that he at one point expresses this contrarian view that gets him in trouble. But then, so he has this fall from grace, and it's looking like he's going to probably be arrested, possibly sent to Siberia, so on and so forth. But then he has a stroke of luck, and he's restored to the good graces of the Soviet authorities, and he gets to go back to work, and he has everything made, basically. And then he does something that is so against the values that he espoused earlier in the novel, and he feels so bad about the fact that he did this thing. I don't want to spoil what it is, but he does something that is so against his own values and so hypocritical that he feels intensely ashamed. And, you know, that's one of the hardest passages to read, right? Because of course, I don't think any one of us who grew up in, you know, a free society could really legitimately say that we would have acted differently, because we've never been under the stress of living in these repressive societies. But still, somehow, Victor Strum's story manages to end on a hopeful note. He kind of says, you know, I've done this thing, but I'll try to be better in my life to come. And that's kind of where his story ends. And again, I thought it was really powerful, because he clearly is not a perfect person, really far from perfect, but he still is sort of extended grace by the author, right? And I just thought that was really powerful, and again, just spoke to how well this novel portrays living in this repressive society. And it reminded me of something, and I'll close with this. It reminded me of something that I once heard Julian Barnes say in an interview. Julian Barnes, great British novelist, wrote a novel actually about Dmitri Shostakovich, the great Russian composer, who had a lifelong struggle with the authoritarian regime that he lived under, and who was actually mentioned in this novel once. But he says of Shostakovich that, or at least I think he's paraphrasing something Shostakovich said, but he says that being a hero is a one-time commitment, whereas being a coward is a lifetime practice. And so we think of these single acts of heroism as the things for praise, but being a coward is arguably more difficult because it's a lifetime commitment. And I'm not saying that to say that being a coward is a good thing, but I'm also saying that to point out the fact that, again, I don't think any one of us could sit on our high horses and say that we would have acted differently than Victor Strum did. So, anyway, I'll leave it at that. I've gone on at some length, but if you've read Life and Fate, I would absolutely love to talk about it with you in the comments. But I will just leave it at that. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't read Life and Fate, then it's one of those books, probably one of the only books that I could count on one hand that I would say is just a must-read for everyone. So, anyway, yeah, I will leave it at that. I will talk to you all later. Bye.